We are thrilled to have welcomed Dr. Nidhi Sachdeva from the Ontario Institute for Studies in Education at the University of Toronto as the ULEARN 2025 keynote speaker. One of our program staff first had the privilege of hearing Dr. Sachdeva at the Research Egg Conference in Toronto in 2024, which is a global movement dedicated to bridging the gap between educational research and classroom practice. Research Egg events have been held in cities around the world, from London to Amsterdam to Melbourne to Toronto, just bringing together researchers, educators, and policymakers for a day of insight, evidence, and myth busting. Dr. Sachdeva's work sits at the intersection of research and practice, making complex ideas about how we learn both accessible and actionable for educators. In her keynote, she will explore the science of learning, offering both a broad introduction and practical strategies we can apply in our own classrooms to support student success. Her expertise, energy, and commitment to evidence-informed practice promise to inspire and challenge us as we continue on our own learning experiences.
Perfect. So I'd like to begin by offering a personal version of land acknowledgement on my end. So again, everyone, good afternoon and good morning over here in Ontario, in Toronto. My name is Nidhi Sachdeva, and I join you today from Toronto, the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, and Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples. As someone who grew up in India and now lives as an immigrant in Canada, I continue to reflect on what it means to live and learn on Indigenous land. And as I raise my 3 children in Canada, I often reflect on the precious moments we experience because of the land. Whether it's hiking or biking along the many amazing trails in the city, playing in local parks, or being so lucky to be able to take in the immense beauty during our travels across this absolutely gorgeous country. It truly is a humbling experience, and these moments remind me of the deep privilege of living on and benefiting from this land's generosity. And I do my best to pass this awareness on to my children, who are actually working in the front yard and cleaning up the plants right now, helping them understand that acknowledging the land also means respecting its history, its caretakers, and our shared responsibility towards it. While we gather virtually, I also want to acknowledge the homelands of the Indigenous peoples of Newfoundland and Labrador, including the Beothuk, Mi'kmaq, Innu, and Inuit communities. I honor their enduring presence, knowledge, and stewardship of these lands, past and present. And as an educator and immigrant, I am committed to learning the truths of this land's history and walking alongside Indigenous communities on the path toward reconciliation. Thank you again for welcoming me in this wonderful shared space of learning. So today, what I want to talk to you all about is this idea of science and learning and cognitive science, and why it is so essential for every educator to know about it. And what are some of the considerations that we as educators should be paying attention to? And if we're not, then there's a lot at stake. So I'm going to unpack this idea of science and learning and its emergence from cognitive science and what every educator should be considering when it comes to teaching. I want to begin by this idea that we are doing a very hard work. Teaching is really, really hard work. Teaching is tough. Teaching is dynamic. Teaching is challenging. Teaching is demanding. So we are putting in a lot of the effort. But what's happening is that even though our intentions, our efforts are well intended, but something about our current instructional efforts are not meeting the needs of all learners. And this is the truth. I mean, if I were to talk about Ontario, the EQAO scores will tell you that. Or if we hear from the stories about children struggling to read at the grade level, I mean, reading, the right to read inquiry is exactly what it showed us, right? So this is not a made-up statement that we are in many ways, despite our efforts, are not meeting the needs of our learners. And for me, in this current moment in time, this really is the heart of the matter. If it's not meeting the needs of our learners, then we have to do something. And that shift perhaps is long overdue. And there's lots of things that happen that have led us to this path. And that's probably a presentation in its own. But the truth is that teacher training programs, current educators, in-service educators, despite their well-intended efforts, something's missing. And it's nobody's fault. It's just how things evolve. But now is the time that we say, okay, let's pause and understand, well, what do we need to know so we can actually do something about it? So I'm going to tell you a real story, a true story. This is a story in my neighborhood. So as I said, I live in Toronto, and I live in what they call is Midtown Toronto. Public school education system is fairly nice. My kids also go to a public school. So we walk from our home to their school. It's about a 10-minute walk. And I'm just changing the names of the kids here. So these are completely pseudonyms. So don't read too much into the names of the children that I'm using. It's just generic. I'm calling one child Will, another child Bill. Really means nothing. It's just two kids whose names you don't need to know, but I want to tell you a story about them. So Will lives close by, walks out of the home, and is walking to school. But he's going a bit earlier than the school started, which is about 8:52 or 8:55 or something like that. But he goes at about 8 o'clock or 7:45, because just before, maybe 200 meters before the school, there's a tutoring center where Will's going to stop with his parents, and he's going to walk in and get a lesson on reading. And that's the statement first I'm going to make. Will goes to learn how to read before going to school. And I think that statement alone should be keeping us all at night, right? But this is Will's piece. Now, Will, at the point when I'm reminding myself of the story, he was about in grade 3, but because he wasn't reading as well as he needed to, his parents took the action and he was going to this tutoring center. But there's another kid who lives close by as well, Bill, who walks at the same normal time to go to school and just goes to school. Does not end up going to the tutoring center, but has the exact same challenges when it comes to reading. Because Bill's parent cannot afford the, I don't know, $80 an hour reading instruction, the one-on-one differentiated instruction. But this is the point, right? Will manage to learn, but at what cost? Really, the dollar value, the parental resources, knowing about it. And then the second is Bill's situation. But the bigger situation is that why is this happening outside of the school? And why is this happening for Bill inside the school? And this is a real story. I'm not making this up. And I've thought about it often, and I've shared the story. And I think every time I think about it, it makes me even more worried about that. This is how we widen the equity or inequity gap. You know, we call it the Matthew effect. The rich get richer, poor get poorer. In reading instruction, former researcher at Ontario Institute for Studies in Education, his name is Keith Stanowich, called it the Matthew effect in reading. Basically, when children can read sooner, then they read more, so they gain more knowledge. And when children can't read sooner, then they don't tend to read and don't get to make the knowledge or develop the knowledge. So the equity gap widens, right? So this is a real story. And I think that's happening. I just shared the story with regards to reading. Well, then there's science and there's math, and you know how many Kumons and Oxfords and so many other centers do we have. Now, it's not about them. It's about us within the public education system. The one more thing I want to add about this story is that when I saw this happening and I thought, hey, what is this center where the kids go? My kids didn't go because they have an educator for a parent, so they learn to read, and I spend a lot of time. But again, that's an equity piece too, because I am a parent with a lot of resources of knowledge of how to read and what support I need to provide to my kids. So I inquired, I'm like, oh, what is that? And it turns out it's like a smaller tutoring center. I go to their website. I'm not going to tell the name of it, but I just wanted to see, what does it say? And the first thing it said on the website, it says, we teach using direct instruction. And that's something I'm going to be talking about as well. And I'm thinking to myself, but that's science of learning, isn't it? And it's basically freely available to us. But why is it that we need to pay for it privately, where we could be doing this in our school too? So just to set up the stage for this story, I just want to remind you all that I can't see the visuals of your faces right now because I'm seeing my slides because I'm sharing the screen. But if there's anything, you know, feel free to interrupt in between, or we have a half an hour at the end together where I'm happy to take any questions and have a conversation with you all. But at any point, if there's any issue happen, just let me know through a vocal command. So there is no doubt that learning is a very complex sort of process, right? Learning is complex. That's the truth. Now, learning is influenced by social and cultural factors. Nobody's denying that. And that's why a lot of our social sort of supports in schools and the way we teach Sure, they feed into this idea, and very, very essential too. Learning is also impacted by motivational and affective factors, right? Like, is the child happy? Is there problems at home, the financial issues, or did the child have breakfast in the morning? Yes, all these things, the mood, all of that. Or did they get bullied during recess, or something else happened? And if you're older, then maybe they're having challenges with their relationships, romantic relationships, and things like that. Yeah, learning gets impacted by all of that, and absolutely no denying that. But then there's also the cognitive factors, right? The actual process of learning that's happening in the brain. And I love to talk about them all, but my focus today is going to be really on the cognitive component for two reasons. First, I'm a bit of an expert in that area, and I study it and I research it, and that's where cognitive science feeds into what we now understand as science of learning. But the other reason is that we may or may not have a lot of control at an instructional level as teachers on to changing these social and cultural factors, or the motivational and affective factors, right? What's happening in a child's life outside of the classroom, we can listen, we can offer support, or we can direct them to different kinds of support system, but that's a much systemic level of thing. But instructionally, one area where you really have a massive control over is the cognitive factors that impact learning. And so it makes sense that as an instructor, as an educator, a classroom teacher, we should be focusing on the cognitive factors too. And it just so happens that this is not something that for a long time the teacher education programs have been focusing on. You know, I'm not saying completely ignored, but the focus is not there. And you can think back to your experience and say, hey, did I know, did I not know, or how much of that we did? And motivational affective factors kind of get influenced indirectly by the cognitive factors. We'll briefly touch upon that as well, right? But that's what I'm going to focus on. So I'm going to say that learning is complex. If learning is complex, then it makes sense that teaching is also complex, right? If learning is complex, then teaching is also a complex thing or process. So it makes sense for us to try to unpack the first to be able to do the second better, right? For the sake of our learners. So I want to share this quote with you, and usually I don't read out the quotes. I let people read the quotes, so I'll give you a few seconds to read it. This is by Lee Shulman. So it's kind of interesting, right? Lee Shulman, in a paper called Wisdom of Practice, comparing sort of the medicine field to teaching field, saying that the only time medicine ever approaches the complexity of an average day for a classroom teacher is in an emergency room during a natural disaster. And this is to show that this is a really tough job that you're doing. So thank you, first of all, for doing that. But how do you make it work? And this particular scenario, if it is so complex, if it is so dynamic, if it is so demanding, then doesn't it make sense for us to actually have a solid control over the evidence so that we know something already, and then there is the other things with which we can work with, intuitions and some other aspects of it. But if you already have the evidence, then aren't you increasing your ability, your possibilities to actually do this rather complex job in a more effective way, right? That's why pilots have such an intense training, because things need to happen because there's a safety issue, right? Teaching may not feel like that from that perspective, but it's someone's long-term future of what their career is going to be like, what their life is going to be like. So evidence is actually quite a powerful thing in this kind of scenario, right? I want to share another quote here with you. This is by a former president of MIT. Pretty simple, but look how powerful it is. I'll let you read it for a second. Pretty obvious, isn't it? If we don't know how we learn, how on earth do we know how to teach? It kind of goes together, right? And here's my one more quote. And I'll say why this is really important to me after you've had a moment to read it and absorb it. So this is a quote by John Sweller, still continuing to do amazing work out of Australia. He developed the cognitive load theory, and he said that if we don't have an understanding of the human cognitive architecture, the cognitive ways that we learn, then we are probably highly likely shooting in the dark. Instruction is blind, right? It's like letting someone treat a patient with just like, try this, try this, try this, but we don't do that. Why are we allowing ourselves in a classroom to do that too? I'm not saying you're doing it, but the role of evidence needs to be so much higher in classrooms. And you probably already, I mean, the fact that you've invited me to speak about it, that seed, and maybe a seedling or maybe a plant is already there in your hearts and your brains and your classrooms, but we got to make it so much bigger. And that was the big reason for me to actually bring back research ed as well, or wanting to attend one and hence creating one in Canada or starting one in Canada. So this quote is actually really the basis of my presentation. We are all here because we develop content, we teach, and we design instruction, right? And this quote is a powerful reminder why we need to have a foundational understanding of how learning happens so that we can support our learners in the best possible way. And it's definitely one of my favorite quotes as an educator, and of course also as a learning designer. Anytime I'm creating a micro lesson or any material or even a presentation like that, I'm thinking about you, always. So this is sort of where the idea of science of learning fits, right? What science of learning really seeks to answer is this question that's in front of you. What do we know about how students learn? And what does that mean for how we teach? And science of learning may not have all the answers, but it has a good, fair number of answers for us, right? So we're going to be talking about that, right? So what do we know about how students learn? And how does that help us? Okay, so there's some essentials that I'm going to be sharing with you all, and hopefully that you can take that into your upcoming school year, and your students will be the beneficiaries of that. Word of thought and caution here. So I know within the teaching space, teachers are often presented with, hey, here's a new initiative. And I've been told that initiative is a trigger word. So it is not an initiative. Science of learning isn't. And teachers have been provided with all sorts of professional development in the name of this, in the name of that. And I'm sure at some point learning styles has also been presented that this is evidence. So this happens quite often. So if you've received that and you've sat through those sessions, that's just because that's how it has been, which is why I think there is a deeper demand, deeper sort of insight right now. It's that I think we have to start questioning everything and look towards the evidence, and also start to understand what good evidence, what evidence counts as good evidence. So what science of learning is not, is that it's not a fad or a trend or something new that I'm going to be throwing guys, oh yeah, you should do that. It's more like a toolkit, right? To ensure that you're in a position to provide an equitable and effective instruction. That's the goal. We want that to be the case. And it's also not that shiny new thing. You know, we call it the shiny new syndrome. There's all these new things come. It's like, oh, this is going to solve the problem. This is going to revolutionize this and that. It's not that. Science of learning is not in one specific thing. It's a much bigger body of literature that provides you with guidelines. But it's not a prescription that 10 mg of direct instruction and 2 milligrams of retrieval practice, and then voila, things will be okay. No, it gives you the power to make certain decisions. So it's not the shiny new thing, because it's been around for many decades, and the evidence is extremely powerful, right? Not from sort of just one or two studies, but replicated study after study after study, and it has generalized certain really powerful instructional approaches and strategies that if we use them, then we make our classrooms a place of equity and effective instruction. But here's an interesting question. Well, Nidhi, what sets SOL apart, science and learning apart? Well, we've heard this before, this and that. Well, science and learning comprises of robust theories that are not developed in someone's minds, theories developed from evidence. Evidence builds theory. Theory does not sort of guide evidence. That would be wrong, right? Evidence builds theories, robust theories of teaching and learning supported by rigorous and relevant research evidence, and then replicated over and over again. So in this diagram that we call the hierarchy of evidence, it is often used within medical profession, but I like to use this for my teacher educators as well when I teach my science and learning course to them, is that the studies in our course, or even in my presentation that I'm going to be sharing with you, are really on top of this hierarchy of evidence, on top of this pyramid, and many of them are randomized controlled trials, very high quality research, which kind of like an experimental study, right? Control group, experimental group, and randomized controlled trials, randomly assigned participants. And then there's lots of these systematic reviews and meta-analyses as well, through which we draw upon, or upon which we draw and understand these science and learning guidelines. So meta-analysis sometimes will look at things like all the studies that have looked at growth mindset and does it support student achievement, for example. And then the researchers will have their own inclusion and exclusion criteria based on how good was this study. And sometimes they may end up with hundreds of studies. Sometimes they may end up with 20 or 30 studies, and they look at those studies and they generalize certain findings. And so those are really powerful because it's not one study, it's multiple studies that they have looked at. They've kind of like taken apart, and then they say, oh, all these studies direct to that, or there was inconsistencies or things like that. So those are powerful, and I like to share them with my students, and that's what I'm going to be sharing with you as well today. And one more thought on science and learning. So science and learning, again, is kind of like a navigation system for you. Okay, so it's a research-based GPS for navigating student learning. Without it, we may be relying too much on good intentions. Not a bad thing, but is it going to be effective or not? You don't know that. But if you follow the evidence, then the chances are much higher, right? So we may be relying without it on good intentions and inconsistent and ineffective practices. But here's the thing. Our students deserve better. They really do, okay? So that's something that I want to talk about. I mean, using GPS is not new to us, right? When you need to go to from place A to B, let's say you know how to get there already, but we still use GPS because the GPS might tell us where there's traffic, where there's road closures, and let's avoid it. If we do that for driving because we're thinking about, hey, I need to get to a point fastest, classroom instruction, so science and learning is acting like that GPS for us. So we should be using it, right? Because if we want to get to a place faster with the shortest sort of amount of time taken, or no traffic or no roadblocks, then that's something our students deserve too. And science and learning has something to offer to us in making our instruction powerful. You probably have heard of The Powerful Teaching by Patrice Bain as well. Okay, so I want to begin real quick with a small poll, very quick poll. I'm going to get to that in a second. I have to unshare my screen for a second and then take you to a different page. But the simple question is, how do you define learning? What's interesting is that I'm asking a room full of educators, how do you define learning? It's a loaded question. So let me take you to the Slido here. So you probably, let me know if you see a Slido with a QR code, and it's got the code as well. So what you could do is you could just go to slido.com and type in the code that you see. I'm just going to refresh this page to make sure that it's working. So take a moment, and if you are logging in or if you have access to a device, just type in. I can see one participant typing. Just type in, how do you define learning? It's anonymous, so I won't see your name. I just want to see how people define learning. And obviously there's no wrong answers, but how do you see it, this process called learning? Changing behaviors and attitudes. changing in knowledge over time. To learn is to do better than yesterday. Powerful. There's lots more folks typing in, so we'll wait. An iterative process of contextual meaning making. Beautiful. Knowledge gathered, knowledge retained. Oh, now this pouring in. Deeper understanding of a topic. I'm trying to read. Developing understanding of new concepts, making changes in behavior and making it internal. Knowing more at the end of a class than you knew at the beginning. Yes, a means by which we acquire new understanding and skills. When you can retrieve content from memory without resorting to external resources. Yes. When a student can independently and confidently accomplish a task. When we actively engage with ideas, connect them to what we already know and apply them in meaningful ways. Beautiful. Long-lasting permanent change in long-term memory. Acquisition of knowledge, understanding, and skills. It causes a permanent change in what we know and do. Yeah. Learning something new or developing a deeper understanding of it. Look how beautiful these definitions are. Understanding and putting your understanding in action. Yeah, transferring it. Bettering understanding and sharing knowledge. To understand concepts, to transfer this to multiple situations. A shift. Learning that results in change. Gaining new knowledge or skills. Opportunity to grow. Deeper understanding of a topic. Learning is progression of truths that are discovered through wonder and confirmation of thoughts and reflections. That you can teach others. Learning is the brain's fuel to keep living. I see one more participant typing. This is wonderful. Thank you. I'm so glad. I hope it worked relatively easy at your end. Brain activated, interest peaked, and skills acquired. And one more. Learning is acquiring increased skills, information, and knowledge. Wonderful. How we grow by absorbing what we discover. Oh, that's beautiful. So I'm seeing, on the top, the tool kind of automatically did like a bit of a synopsis for me. So you see lots of people use the word understanding, knowledge, skills, change, behaviors, and learning. So it's kind of cool that you can see a pattern there, right? So that's wonderful. Thank you. And someone already did say a very close definition of what I'm going to share as my definition with you. So thank you for participating in that poll with me, folks. I really appreciate it. I'm going to share my definition of learning because I'm focusing on the cognitive aspect of learning. And that doesn't mean that I don't care about the other aspects. They really are. But it's where the instruction has the most massive control, which is your cognitive aspect, right? So I'm going to go with the definition by Paul Kirshner. So take a look at it. Simple. Somebody did say it. I don't know who that was, but that was cool. And all the definitions were beautiful because there's no wrong answer because those are all definitions of learning. But why I'm going to focus on this one is because when you view learning as a change in one's long-term memory, then that's how you design instruction. If that's your goal, then that's how you design instruction. And then that changed long-term memory can create everything that you all said in those messages. Acquiring knowledge, using the skills, transferring it to others, understanding it in a deeper way, sharing it further with folks. But if your goal is to change one's long-term memory, then that tells you how you're going to design or how you should design instruction. And one thing I will say is that once the long-term memory changes, it really changes you. It really changes you every second in the classroom for a child, for a learner, for you all right now in this moment, for me. It changes us. So it's a very powerful thing that's happening. And the medium to reach that is instruction, right? I mean, of course, there's observation, there's other things that are happening too, but in a classroom, it's instruction. So that's it's a mind-boggling idea how powerful that is. So it's the change in one's long-term memory. And this is Paul Kirshner's very famous definition. And I like it because it's simple, but it's deep, but it's practical, because then it helps us understand what we need to do with instruction. And this takes me to what I'm going to be covering the next part of the session. I'm going to talk to you all about the information processing model, which is sort of the basis of it all. And then I want to talk about how different ways there are that learning or these cognitive processes, if we said learning is a change in long-term memory, and what can stop that learning in the change in long-term memory from happening. So we're going to look at some of those challenges, those pitfalls, those choke points, right? And then I'm going to talk to you about 3 whole class instructional strategies. I'm a big fan of whole class instructional strategies. That doesn't mean that I don't support one-on-one. Of course I do, but I think we can cast a much wider net for our learners and catch as many of those challenges as possible to understand where we need to do more than. And the research actually shows that these whole class instructional strategies have the power for us to do that, to reach more learners. And these have been shown to reduce inequities from those really high, the circle on the hierarchy of evidence pyramid that I showed you. These are those studies that have shown that these 3 whole class instructional strategies have shown to reduce inequities. So let's begin real quick with the basis of it all, the information processing model. So many of you will probably be already familiar with this. So it's taught in most educational psychology courses or in Psych 101 courses. If that's the case, please bear with me as I briefly explain this concept. If this is new to you, I think you'll find it useful to understand how humans learn cognitively. So let's try to understand that through the lens of information processing model. So the information processing model begins with the sensory memory, okay, right up top in this visual that you see. We receive information through our senses, primarily through visual and auditory channels. So think of the green squares as the new knowledge, right? The new information that learners are learning, you're learning, or whatever the scenario might be. But before this new knowledge can be stored in long-term memory, it must first pass through and be processed in working memory, which is sort of the middle step. Oops. But our working memory, sorry, I accidentally pressed 1 extra time, so ignore that. But our working memory, a couple of things that we need to know about. It has a very limited capacity. It's what we're conscious of at any given time, okay? Research suggests that we can only hold anywhere from 4 to 7 chunks of information in our working memory at any one time. So here's an example. If I gave you a list of 3 random numbers, you could probably keep them in your working memory. And several minutes later, you could tell me those numbers, right? But if I gave you a list of 20 random numbers, it would quickly become very hard for you to remember them all, right? Because we can only keep a certain amount of information in our working memories. So in some sense, you can think of working memory as a bottleneck, right? And there are limits to the speeds at which students can take in and process new knowledge. And they go through this every single time when we are teaching them something new, okay? So that's a reality of the working memory. Now, the final step in the learning process from a cognitive point of view is a deliberate effort on the part of the learner to encode, to store this new knowledge, the green squares, in our long-term memories, to move it from the working memory to the long-term memory, okay? And what do we do to do this? Learners do this by connecting the new knowledge to what they already know. So think of the blue squares as the prior knowledge. Nobody comes to you as a learner completely empty vessel. They know things from their background, from their home. So their background knowledge is a massive asset to educators, right? So that's the final step. Now, initially, when the new knowledge goes into the working long-term memory, it is encoded or stored somewhat weakly. But with practice, if we keep working with it, maybe some kind of rehearsal to it, it becomes more firmly embedded in our long-term memory. And how do we know that? Is when we can quickly recall it. Over time, we create stronger and stronger linkages to the new knowledge along with the prior knowledge, okay? And this is what we call learning. It's about storing new knowledge in our long-term memory so that we can access it again later. I'll say it again. Learning is about storing new knowledge, letting it pass through the working memory, storing it in our long-term memory so that we can access it again later. Okay? And if you remember how this visual began, the green squares were not in the long-term memory, but they are now. So Paul Kirchner's definition, which is learning is the change in long-term memory, you can see the change. I mean, of course, it's an organizer, it's a graphic, visual of it's not really how it is in our brain, but it's a simple way to understand it, right? So that's our information processing model. Really helps to understand the challenges in a moment. But before I do that, I want to touch a little bit upon the cognitive load theory. Understanding the memory systems can help us understand an important theory of instruction. So cognitive load theory is a theory of instructional design, something we do every single day in the classroom, outside the classroom, when we design our lessons and things like that. And that is a cognitive load theory. It is viewed by many as being one of the most, if not the most important theories in education today. Dylan Williams has said that. It predicts very successfully the kinds of situations where learning is likely to occur and where it is not likely to occur. And I want to share briefly this theory with you because I think every teacher should know about it. If you already know this, amazing. If not, it's great to know it. And it is really derived on what we've known about the limitations of working memory, lots of experimentation done, and John Sweller has developed into a very elaborate theory. I'm not going into all the details, but I'll touch upon it because it really, really helps. So going back to our information processing model. So cognitive load theory, as I said, is a theory of instructional design. And this takes into account the limitations of working memory. Okay, it's important to remember that working memory is limited in time, meaning how long something can stay there, and in capacity, meaning how much we can keep in there. And as I mentioned it before, it can hold and process 4 to 7 chunks of information at any given time, and it can get easily overloaded. Knowing just this is going to make us all better educators, because we know when we're teaching too much too fast, we are very quickly overloading our students' working memory. But one way to tackle working memory limitations is to make sure and to support our students gain lots of knowledge. Because once the knowledge lives in their long-term memory, that makes their new learning easier, right? So this is important to remember, that working memory is limited in time and capacity. And what does my learner already knows too? So working memory can get overloaded by many things. I usually like to call it, it's quite moody, or I like to call it, it's kind of like just a very touchy-feely place in our memory system. But the primary sources of cognitive overload comes from what we call, or John Sweller calls, intrinsic and extraneous. So let me tell you a little bit about both of them. So intrinsic load is the effort associated with learning a specific topic for a given learner. We've all experienced this at some point in our lives, and we've experienced high levels of intrinsic load as well, because our lack of background knowledge at something can make the new material very complex for us. Something that's new, calculus, for example, and that impedes learning, that prevents us from learning. We can't really do much about the intrinsic load because it's going to always be there when you learn something new, but we can design instruction in a way that it makes it manageable. And I'm going to talk about that, right? Intrinsic load's always going to be there when students learn something new, but it's in our instructional design that we can organize it, scaffold it, break it down, present it certain ways that it makes it better. So think of lessons that had confusing terminology and abbreviations, or sometimes students don't understand the language. You know, we have lots of young immigrant students in our schools, in our classrooms. All of that is intrinsic load our students feel, or I should say our working memory feels. And high intrinsic load is actually very common. So being aware of that automatically turns us into a more aware educator. The second is extraneous load. Extraneous cognitive load refers to anything that's unnecessary and that does not contribute to learning. So this can be anything that, occur if the teacher has a, let's say, disorganized lesson structure, or a noisy classroom, or too many announcements in the school, or if someone has a toothache, or any number of things, actually. Poor fonts, poor whiteboard structure, too many distractions in the classroom. These are basically things that are distractors from learning. So again, can be very high for a learner, but what it's doing is it's filling up all that space in the working memory and not allowing it to actually process what really matters in the moment. You're teaching fractions, but other things are happening, right? So that what I just presented to you was just to give you a bit of an understanding of information processing model and different forms of cognitive load that can overload our working memory. And I think it's important to know those, because then we can start to unpack, hey, where are my students struggling? Or where are the problems occurring in the learning process? And then maybe you can see what you could do about it. In other words, the question could be, why do struggling learners struggle? Why? So let's step back for a second and think about why some students have more difficulty learning. What are some of the things that can go wrong and where? All right. So back to my information processing model. So let's look, this is the cognitive process where the learning was happening. Let's look where can problems occur, right? So learning processes can be interrupted at multiple places. And again, I'm sharing this with you because if we know this, then we can do something about it. And that's something I'd like to share as the next part of my presentation. So I'm going to try to mention the main areas where learning can break down. There's many, many reasons for learning to break down, but from a cognitive point of view, I'm going to share 5 major ones towards which we have some power in our instruction to do something about that. Okay, not always, but we could. That's what science of learning tells us, where we can truly support our struggling learners, all learners for that matter. So the first one is the limited size of the working memory, right? Now, this is true for everyone, but some students may even have smaller working memories than others. Some students may have things going on in their life that will take up space in their working memory. So for example, if a student is prone to distraction for some reason, or if they're hungry, or if they're worried about being bullied at recess, or if they're anxious about something at home, they may have less available working memory capacity to dedicate to learning. And mind you, this capacity that's already limited, right? Because that's a natural scenario. So what this means is that if the teacher assigns a task that can put a lot of strain on working memory, students with working memory limitations will be then disadvantaged, right? Second, really, really common, prior knowledge. Inadequate prior knowledge in long-term memory. So really amazing researcher named David Ausubel, he wrote, the most important single factor influencing learning is what the learner already knows. Ascertain this and teach them accordingly. So we learn new things by connecting new knowledge to existing knowledge. And this is no secret. That moment of, connection, it's happening, right? So problems can occur, however, if students lack the prior knowledge they need to make sense of the new knowledge. Someone learning to add fractions or subtract fractions cannot do something before having learned that this is numerator, this is the division line, this is denominator. That's prior knowledge, right? This can happen if a teacher assumes all students know certain facts, for example. And this can disadvantage students who may come from, let's say, different cultures, have different traditions, or are unfamiliar with certain languages. And they may not understand certain references. And so learning fails because these students are unable to make the connections that other students are able to make. Consequently, an instructor should try to ascertain whether the learner possesses the necessary prior knowledge. If the learner lacks the prior knowledge should be taught first. Now, this is one of the motivations of things like culturally responsive teaching and developing a kind of sensitivity to situations where learning might be jeopardized because of a lack of foundational knowledge or language barriers or cultural knowledge that learners might know. So, having knowledge-rich curriculum is such a beautiful thing. It's awe-inspiring, it's curiosity-inspiring, but it also provides the background knowledge for children to learn the next step. The third place where problems can occur is what we call lack of motivation. Now, this is a concern. To learn something, students must make a deliberate effort to connect the new knowledge in their working memory to things they already know. If they lack motivation to do that, then learning won't happen. A point on this: students generally feel demotivated when they are not able to do something. They feel frustrated, so they don't want to do it. But if we provide them with all the tools, all the background knowledge, then the chances for them to be more successful, or chances for them to be more experience self-efficacy, success, become higher. So we have a bit of control in our instruction, that we provide them with all the tools, all the knowledge, all the steps, so they can do something successfully. And once they do that, they have more motivation to learn. But a child who's frustrated, feeling overwhelmed, feeling demotivated because they can't do something, that is going to create further lack of motivation. So you see, what I'm trying to say is that success breeds motivation. So make opportunities for your learners to be successful, and we have control in our instructional design to be able to do that. The fourth place where problems can occur is problems processing visual, auditory, verbal, or textual information. I mean, this is something if a student, they have difficulty attending to or processing various kinds of incoming content, then of course they're going to struggle initially, right? And last but not the least, problems can occur when students have problems solidifying and retaining the new knowledge, the green squares, after it's presented. Students tend to also think that once they see something and they've understood it, that they've also learned it. No. Practice is an essential ingredient for them to be able to do that. I've seen this with my own kids so many times. They feel like, I know how to do it. And I was like, okay, then they don't want to do it. And then a little bit later, I'll give them the question and they'll be like, oh. But I know, I understand. Students have an illusion of that. Understanding is not the same thing as being able to do that. So you need that practice. I'm going to talk about that in my instructional piece. I may speak a little bit longer than my assigned speaking time, but I will spend definitely the remaining time taking the questions, because I think important stuff that I want to share with you all. So some students may set down some initial memory traces in long-term memory, but they are never really solidified. And then they become inaccessible, right? Students cannot recall it. And when they can't recall it, then they can't save themselves when the question presents itself, right? Now, all of these things are the ways learning processes can break down, okay? Here's a list of them one more time. I'll let you have a moment with these while I take a sip of water. I'm just going to close this as well. There we go. These are the 5, but not the only. It's not an exhaustive list, but this is a very, very important list for us educators to understand, that these are quite common areas where our students would be struggling. What can we do about these? Okay. But before that, I like to do a visual break. This is not related to my presentation, but I like to, when we learn too much for too long, it's nice to take a little break. And this is such a cute picture of a giraffe playing a little bit with a young girl, probably about 3-4 years old. This is a beautiful manor called the Giraffe Manor in Africa. I believe it's in Kenya or Tanzania. I can't remember right now. But this is a famous photographer named Robin Moore, and takes beautiful pictures of all kinds of places and people. But the Giraffe Manor is one of my favorite as well. And I just like to add this as a bit of a visual break. Okay, nice, because we're learning heavy stuff here, talking about challenges of our learners, and teachers need that a little break as well. So there's that. Okay, good. Let's move on. So now that we understand that we have students, and it's always going to be the case, who are going to struggle. Some of our best students who have no challenges sometimes will have struggling days too, depending on the content, depending on whatever those, choke points or pitfalls may happen that I was just sharing. The question then becomes, well, what do we do? Or what should we do to help our struggling students? You don't have to share with me, but I want you all to think about this question and answer for yourself for just 1 second. What is currently happening for when we understand a student is struggling? Where are these students going to seek help? Or where are they getting help from? Are they getting help? we can't just leave them alone, can we? That is not an option, because we have a commitment towards all our students. That's the job of a teacher, right? I know it's tough, but you can't leave them alone. So just think about that for your own self. You don't have to answer that to me, but you should know or think, what do we do? What are we doing? At a policy level, at a system level, what is our school board suggesting us to do? What is the ministry suggesting us to do? And is it helping? That is an important thought to consider, all right? And continue to think about that. But here I am. I want to share with you the 3 whole class instructional strategies that research has shown to reduce inequities. If we know that they're struggling, then we must do something about it. Rather than trial and error, means ends analysis, let's look at the evidence and see what the evidence says. These are general teaching practices that are highly associated with more equitable student outcomes. And these approaches are backed by a large number of studies, hundreds of studies sometimes, with very high effect sizes. However, I find these 3 things are rarely talked about in teacher education program or in-service training and other forms of teacher development. But I'm not going to miss that. Today, you've invited me to speak to you all, so I'm going to share these 3 with you all. The first one is explicit instruction. Before I tell you what explicit instruction is, let me take you back on the poll. And it's the same space of the poll, and you should see this question if you go back to slido.com and put in the same code again. And in one word or phrase, how would you describe, not you, but how people typically view explicit instruction as? Share with me. I'll take a moment here. It's not about how you think it is, but how you hear people describe it, or how the systems or school boards or ministries or other areas might be sharing it. Yes, boring, passive, militant, lecture, traditional, lecture. Yeah, boring. Teacher lecture, the whole group with examples. Teacher-centered, traditional, chalk and talk. Great podcast, by the way. Not hands-on, boring to students. One-way instruction from the teacher, boring. I'll tell you and then you know it. Telling is not teaching, they say, you know. Traditional methods of teaching. Yeah, traditional, that's a word often used because blah, blah, blah. Very good. Thank you. Talking. So I'm seeing like the highlights up there. Traditional, lecture, student, boring, teacher at the front of a class. I know. Yeah, those are good popular sort of representations of explicit instruction. Time consuming. Telling without exploring. Wonderful. These are great. I should take them. Not interactive. Exactly. That's a really big one. One-sided. Great. Well, thank you. Thank you. This is what I was hoping you would share with me. So thank you. But I'll tell you what explicit instruction really is. So when teachers teach primarily through explicit instruction rather than say through discovery or inquiry-based learning, what they're actually doing is they level the playing field a bit, because low achieving students are more likely to have success when their instructor teaches explicitly. True story. So what is direct instruction or explicit instruction? Paul Kirshner developed this slide many years ago and he thought he wouldn't need it ever again. But what do you know? Explicit instruction is still being misunderstood. So we got this wonderful slide. So what it isn't is it's not drill and practice. It's not rote learning. It's not just good for teaching facts and procedures or only good for teaching basic skills. And it's not boring or just teacher directed, teaching basic skills in isolations. It is not that. But what it really is that it actually involves active learning. Now, active may not be that your students are moving around in a classroom and doing all sorts of things. Minds-on active. The word active is actually really, really misunderstood. And the studies have done a very bad job also defining it. Student-friendly. It's very student-friendly. Why? Because Paul Kirshner says, because they learn. It's cognitively engaging because students have opportunities to self-monitor. It's concerned with students developing conceptual understanding and deriving meaning. It's developmentally appropriate, tailored to students' learning needs. It's about changing the long-term memory. Students are engaged as active participants in explicit instruction, the true explicit instruction that many people who claim those things that you just shared with me, I'm not saying you believe in it, I did ask you what you have heard it being presented as, right? But it's actually really active for a learner here. And it's used, it can be used in diverse contexts and curricular areas. So Paul developed this slide and he posted it on Twitter, and I asked him many years ago, so I've been using this in my presentations too, and he thought he just did it for one session and I'd be like, the misconception will be gone. What do we know? I don't know how many years it's been, probably 10, but we still talk about it. But because you're attending this presentation, you're on the other side now, and you'll be spending the rest of your career, hopefully not all of your career, but some years at least, fighting, advocating for explicit instruction for the right reasons, because people misunderstand it. There's a lot of misunderstanding. So let me tell you a little bit about it. In the research literature, we found that, and when I say we, my colleague Jim Hewitt and I, we study this quite a bit, we found explicit instruction was frequently recommended for a wide variety of struggling students. For example, students with learning disabilities, English language learners, students with ADHD, students with executive functioning issues, low achieving students, students with memory difficulties. But what is explicit instruction? Well, explicit instruction is sometimes, sadly quite often, misunderstood as exactly what you told me, as lecturing or passive learning. But it's actually much more complex than that. And it's not passive process for the students at all. That is not how it was designed, or it is designed. Explicit instruction involves the teacher presenting new knowledge to students, okay? It's instruction that is structured, sequenced, and led by this teacher for the benefit of the learner. It's maybe teacher-led, but it's student-centered, because student is at the center of it. It is scientifically developed by Barak Rosenstein, who studied 3 different literatures. It wasn't just that he just came up with these ideas. They sat through so many classroom observations to understand what is it that the teachers are doing, great teachers, expert teachers are doing that's working so well. And so he developed initially 17 principles and then were published as 10 principles in a report published by UNESCO. So 3 areas that he looked at were cognitive science research, master teachers research, research on cognitive support. And then he developed what he called later the principles of instruction. I believe it was just maybe slightly poor marketing that the word explicit instruction was used or direct instruction was used, but it is so much more than what the label just calls for. And I'd like to tell you about it. What is explicit instruction? Explicit instruction is largely based upon Rosenstein's principles of instruction, which he developed scientifically, as I said, and it has 10 key principles as we know them today. First, daily review. The daily review strengthens connections to prior knowledge. It helps students activate prior knowledge that they'll need for the upcoming lesson. Next, present new material using small steps. The item that has really important connections to working memory, this item. Because working memory is limited in size and we should present new material in small bits so we don't overwhelm our students or confuse them. Third is asking questions. Questions help the teacher determine how well the material has been learned, so it partially serves to diagnose gaps in prior knowledge. However, it's also an opportunity for students to practice recalling information from memory, solidifying new knowledge. Next, modeling. The teacher models what students need to, students are expected to do. I do, we do, you do. This offloads some of the complexity of the task and reduces the strain on the working memory. Makes sense, right? You would never want to learn how to drive without somebody showing you how to do it. You wouldn't want a 16-year-old doing that either, or someone doing surgery for that matter, right? Fifth, guide student practice. Guiding student practice is important because new materials can be quickly forgotten unless students are given a chance to practice it, to elaborate it, and to work on it. This is the active learning part, students doing it. This is where we started reinforcing the mental traces that we initially set down when the teacher presented material to the students. Next, check for understanding, a very, very important step. Checking for student understanding is important for identifying gaps in knowledge. It also helps identify gaps in prior knowledge that you might have not been aware of. Effective teachers frequently check to make sure all students are learning new material. It's a place where teachers can identify and correct misconceptions. Rosenshine also said that obtaining high success rate is a part of explicit instruction. What does he mean? He means a high success rate increases the student's sense of self-efficacy and they become more motivated. During guided instruction and independent practice, he said that teachers should try to achieve a high success rate of around 80%, meaning 80% of the class should be able to do what you just taught. And it's a good indicator that you've broken down the material into manageable chunks and that you presented it clearly. If you have a lower success rate, then it's not a problem with the learner. It's perhaps a sign that we need to rework our lesson somehow. Next, provide scaffolds for difficult tasks. Again, scaffolds can take the form of prompts, checklists, or steps that students have to perform. And they are temporary and they reduce the cognitive load so students can focus on the part of the material and learn. So if you're teaching, let's say, order of operation, students have the list in front of them, and over time they won't need it. Similarly, they learn multiplication. Initially, they can have the times table in front of them, and over time, they memorize them, so they don't need it, right? They should know those facts because it helps them. It reduces stress on the working memory. Number 9, independent practice. Guided practice is followed by independent practice where students work alone. This is where you want to get to, a state where the student has fully understood and acquired the knowledge and skill that you've been teaching them. The student now owns it. And last but not the least, weekly and monthly review. Lastly, weekly and monthly review, Rosenshine says, review strengthens the newly taught knowledge and the cognitive connections that students have already established. You can see from these 10 principles that they're designed to make learning clearer and easier to manage, not to make it boring or passive, especially for students who might not have a strong foundation of the subject. You're helping the ones who really need this, not the ones who can discover because their parents can help them at home. By using clear examples and guided practice, which might include visual aids, step-by-step explanations, this method helps students learn without overloading their working memory. Fundamentally, explicit instruction is effective because it reduces the load on working memory, helps the teacher identify gaps in prior knowledge, supports motivation through a high success rate, and ensures that students practice and solidify new knowledge in their long-term memories. Students need a good deal of practice when learning new material, and effective teachers find innovative ways to do it. Next time when somebody says it's boring and passive, you can see how many times the student is at the center of it all the time. All the time. One point of caution, Rosenshine does not mean it to be a checklist. It doesn't mean to be that you need to have all these 10 principles in every single lesson you do. Sometimes you may have to do better work on checking for understanding and you identify gaps, so you do present the material, reteach it. Sometimes you just have to do more review because the concept just requires more review. Sometimes students need a lot more independent practice depending on what you just taught them, like writing, right? So it's not about that all 10 needs to be done at all times. You become more informed in how you're going to use it. So explicit instruction, I really believe this, is that it is the inclusive and equitable way to teach. Here's a quote from a very famous article that Jim Hewitt and I have written for our Substack. I'll let you read it. It makes sense, doesn't it? Right? It's what we got to do. And then everybody will learn more because it maximizes the number of students in the class who can benefit from a lesson. Isn't that what equity is about? If you want the article, I can send the link as well, but it's on my Substack, which I know Christine's going to share the link. Okay, so am I just saying it? Or is Rosenshine just saying it? Nope. Large-scale analysis have consistently shown that explicit approaches lead to more equitable outcomes. Let's look at a couple of these studies. So one really large-scale study, as you can see over there, it's 56,000 students in 825 schools found that a more explicit teacher-directed instructional approach benefits all students, but It particularly benefits students who come from families where parents have low educational levels. And they found that the disparities between the high and the low achievers were narrowed, I should say, in the explicit teaching condition. It's a popular study by Anderson and Anderson. Here's another one. A controlled study of math teaching in 24 schools in the Netherlands found again that a more explicit teacher-directed instructional approach benefited all students, but it particularly benefited low-achieving students compared to classrooms that used inquiry-based approaches. I really love Carl Hendrick's one quote. He said that discovery learning privileges the privileged, because when you give student a chance to discover something, they pretty much go home and then the parents help or something else helps them. Privilege. So quick summary. There is strong evidence that teachers who teach explicitly by breaking down the content in manageable chunks and then getting students to practice and master a chunk with lots of feedback, you will have more equitable outcomes. But a moment of surprising thing that I want to share with you. This is not new, my friends. We have known about this for over 4 decades, 40 plus years. There's various influential papers written by Barack Rosenshine and another researcher named Robert Stevens, where they've discussed that what they called back in the day, not explicit instruction, but they called it 6 teaching functions. Not only were these instructional functions extremely practical, relatively easily replicable in classrooms and managed by different teachers, Rosenshine and Stevens also presented elaborate classroom research demonstrating that when teachers teach more systematically, student achievement improves. But somehow it's not picked up. It's worrying. Here's a sample. You can see I've circled at the bottom a paper. You probably can't read it, but it's just to show that this is not new. I've been reading this paper. I actually have it in front of me here as well. I don't know if you can see it, but it's not new. We've known about this. And this is, you can see from 1986, and it shows these functions: review, presentation, guided practice, 40 years. And they said it in the simplest language possible. It's really time for us to act on this. Okay, now the last part of it is going to go really quickly, but if I need to stay longer with you folks to answer any questions, I'm happy to do that, but you may need a break, so we'll see how it goes. Second instructional strategy, which I think is very powerful and you should know about it. In fact, Patrice Bain and Pooja Agarwal have called it powerful teaching strategy, retrieval practice. Research suggests that retrieval practice benefits, wait for it, everyone. However, students who are struggling appear to especially benefit. But what is it? Retrieval practice is a strategy that teachers use to promote learning. It involves getting students to practice recalling things they already know. It's about getting kids to pull information out of their heads. The process of retrieving knowledge from memory strengthens and changes the memory. Recall is a learning event. When you get students to recall from memory, you're helping them to learn. You can do things like low stakes quizzes, entrance tickets, ticket at the door, think, pair, share. Research on retrieval practice is overwhelmingly positive. We've known about it for 100+ years, and it demonstrates its effectiveness as an instructional technique. You may already be doing it, but doing it mindfully in a planned way, you're going to enhance and amplify its benefits even more. Because it has 2 big benefits. One, the act of trying to pull memory out actually solidifies the learning and promotes long-term recall. It's also called the desirable difficulty for that reason. And the second is that it is metacognitive, because it helps learner understand better and be aware what they know and they don't know. Kind of great for self-testing. So you're empowering your learner with this too. Here's a small selection of papers that have shown tons and tons of benefits for all the way from preschoolers to graduate students and everyone in between. Students who engage in retrieval practice learn more. It's a great instructional technique, but it's also a great learning strategy. So teach it to your students rather than them highlighting and underlining. Tell them to test yourself. Recall from memory. My child reads recently and then comes and tells me after 1 hour what she read. So then she recalls it. It's been shown to be beneficial for strong learners and for weak learners, and it's particularly good for students who are struggling because of their lower working memory capacity. This is a very powerful, popular paper by Dr. Pooja Agarwal and colleagues, and this experiment found that children with lower working memory capacity for a variety of reasons benefited tremendously. This was a really, really powerful paper. This is another one that found ritual practice can reduce test anxiety. So the more you make it normal for learners, their test anxiety, that would we understand that as it reduces. It doesn't increase it. In fact, it reduces it. So great research paper. So much like explicit instruction, ritual practice appears to be an instructional strategy that can be implemented broadly. And in many ways, ritual practice lives in explicit instruction. Can I remind you how? Daily review, weekly, monthly review, ask questions, check for understanding. All those are kind of ritual practice too. Third recommendation, I'm almost done, I promise. Third recommendation for reducing disparities in academic outcomes is perhaps not surprising. It's formative assessment, which is very similar, and giving regular feedback, similar to ritual practice and giving feedback. These are widely recognized in academic research for playing a significant role in promoting equitable outcomes. They're helpful in multiple ways. Formative assessment with feedback is an approach where teachers regularly check in on student understanding during the lesson and use that information to tweak instruction, guide instruction, plan further lessons, etc. Formative assessment allows teachers to monitor student progress, identify misconceptions, lower the stakes for everyone, and provide timely feedback to guide learning. Providing specific constructive feedback is essential for helping low-achieving students learn new content, understand their mistakes, and make progress over time. Teaching that is rich in formative assessment and learner feedback is associated with more equitable outcomes, and lots of evidence to support that. Much like ritual practice, explicit instruction, the evidence is very powerful in favor of formative assessment. Hundreds of studies have documented this, and timely feedback have shown to be very effective. So this really popular one had 25,000 plus students, and this found that students enrolled in the embedding formative assessment made the equivalent of 2 additional months progress of learning. So all of the summer, imagine, when we talk about summer slide. They also found that the additional progress made by children in the lowest third for prior attainment was greater than the one made by children in the highest third. So again, struggling learners learn more. So when formative assessment is properly orchestrated and made it as a routine, so I have a picture of these young learners holding their whiteboards, mini whiteboards. The benefits of that can be very, very significant. So study after study shows that timely feedback, timely formative assessment, low stakes assessment have been associated with significant increase in student outcome, equity, especially the outcomes of struggling students. I know many times you may hear that, well, science and learning, all this, ideas, is it going to take away my power from me? For one, it's not going to take away your teacher autonomy, because teaching already is quite dynamic. It's not going to dictate your practice. Instead, it offers you reliable evidence-based insights to inform your practice. That's why I'm a big fan of the word evidence-informed instead of evidence-based. Evidence-informed makes you a more informed consumer of evidence, and you make the decisions based on what's happening in the classroom. You may be surprised to hear this quote, this phrase here from 1978, Dr. Nathaniel Lee Gage. He actually was the supervisor of Barack Rosenstein, and he called it something really unique. It's called a scientific basis for the art of teaching. Nobody's confusing, nobody's saying teaching is not an art. It absolutely is. But how about we add a scientific basis to it to make it more powerful and more effective? Now, these aren't just good practices from science and learning. They are evidence-based strategies collected through large-scale studies, tons of observations that can drive equity. I'll leave you with this quote for a second. Right? This is from our article. If we're serious about equity, we have to be serious about learning. It can't be achieved through good intentions and inclusive practices alone. We need to provide knowledge to our learners. And don't take it from me alone. UNESCO has been all about it too. Sustainable Developmental Goal number 4 is about quality education. These are 2 different visuals. I brought them together, and there's a big push for this as well, which is great. We want that, but we don't want it to be a pendulum swing. I want this to be truly understood, not as a buzz, not as a trend. That would really, really be devastating, but truly that evidence-informed practice is what we want to do in education. And this is the last quote. Do the best you can until you know better, and then when you know better, do better. And I'm going to leave you with these words, and I'll stop sharing my screen. I invite you to think about what is that better you're going to start doing this coming school year. I know we don't have much time to discuss, but I will stay around for as long as I need to. Perhaps your better might be taking the time to truly understand what ritual practice is and what it isn't, and then finding ways to purposefully, effectively integrate, but also taking the time to evaluate the effectiveness of your practice. Is it helping my students? Is it helping my struggling students? What can I do differently? Should I discuss with a colleague? What's my better? Or it might be something more specific like, hey, I want to use a lot more check for understanding, creative ways, and I want to start using mini whiteboards. How's that going to be? What am I going to learn? How am I going to learn about that? How do I do that? What's my better going to be? Reflect on it, share with others, seek feedback, push your own comfort zone. And I have to remind you that you're not doing it for yourself, you're doing it for your students. They are the ones who are going to benefit from all the work. Teaching truly, really is a selfless profession, but what a high regard it holds, right? It really is an honor to shape someone's learning journey and in many ways, their future. If you would like to learn more about it, Jim and I write on the Substack. We'll share the link.